All right. Thank you, Chris, for organizing this. Thank you, everyone, for being here. What I will argue here in this presentation is basically that the Qur'anic word ruh does not mean soul at all. And what I would like, I'm not saying that the Quran subscribes to the idea that humans have souls or not. This could be true, or I mean, my own idea now is that it doesn't, but it requires more research, especially on the notion of nafs. So the limit of what I'm arguing is about the word ruh and its meaning. It's a long presentation, and I will be reading it, so bear with me. It is widely accepted in Islamic tradition that the bodies of human beings are animated by souls, what is designated in Arabic by the words ruh, and to a lesser extent nafs, as you all know. It is generally believed that God blew in and presumably instilled the soul into the clay from which he created the first human being, and continues to do so with other humans during their gestations in their mother's wombs, as we have seen a little bit earlier. Although the two words ruh and nafs are often used interchangeably, ruh evokes mostly positive connotations, whereas nafs often designates a lower or lesser ethical type of soul. Muslims tend to believe that these understandings of the words ruh and nafs stem, at least in part, from the Quran. However, the relevant Quranic terms and contexts hardly offer support for this view. In this presentation, I will analyze the Quranic word ruh with the aim of discovering its denotative meanings. I will argue that although the notion of ruh in the Quran has a life-giving power, there is no evidence to corroborate the view that it designates the subtle or spiritual entity or force that is believed to exist within living human bodies. To provide some context for this discussion, I will start with a brief overview of the development of the notion of spirit among some early schools of Islamic thought. Second, I will examine the treatment in Arabic lexicons of the root ra, waw, ha, from which this root is derived. Third, I will discuss the word ruh in Quranic contexts. And finally, I will survey Quranic commentaries from different historical periods to highlight the diachronic progression in the treatment of this notion. In conclusion, I will assess the impact of these interpretations on the Islamic worldview. So I start with my first part, which is the overview of the development of this notion in Islamic thought. The body-soul dualism was not always part of Islamic thought. Emil Homerin maintains that the idea that each human being has a soul became prevalent among Muslims starting from the second century of Islam, which is the 8th century Common Era. Before that, according to Ismail Farouqi, the Muslim had been too engaged in the business of making history to articulate his mission and ideology in a systematic manner. In the 1st century of Islam, indeed, there seems to have been no or little interest in an abstract definition of the nature of the human being. The focus seems to have rather been on practical questions such as humans' ultimate destiny and their religious, legal, and social duties. Homerin states also that, quote, Muslim theologians, philosophers, and mystics have cited various verses from the Quran in support of the soul's existence. Such readings appear indebted more to Aristotle, Neoplatonism, and Christianity than to the Quran with its holistic view of the human being. The body-soul dualism was not the only conception of human nature adopted by Muslim thinkers during Islam's formative centuries. Besides this notion, early Ash'ari and several Mu'tazili scholars conceived of the human being primarily in terms of atoms and accidents. In this conception, humans, similar to any other created being, were believed to consist of collections of atoms which served as seeds for a multitude of accidents. Therefore, instead of relying on the notion of the soul to account for attributes such as life, knowledge, and so forth, these scholars rather conceived of such attributes as accidents that were directly placed in or attached to the atoms of the body. Ayman Shahadi explains that, quote, from the point of view of classical Ash'ari ontology, the need to stipulate a human soul or spirit did not arise. all human attributes and activities are explained by a range of accidents that inhere in the atoms of the bodily composite, including knowledge, thinking, will, and perception. At every moment, each accident is recreated or replaced with a different one by God. End of quote. Since through the notion of accidents, early Ash'aris were able to account for attributes that became later the domain of the soul, of the ruh and nafs, the spirit, as Shihadi observes, would be entirely redundant. This lack of need notwithstanding, both early Ash'ari and Mu'tazili thinkers still subscribed to the opinion that humans had souls. The reason, Shihadi maintains, is that, quote, the Quran and Hadith contain frequent and often vivid depictions of the ruh and nafs of individual human beings. In Shihadi's view, therefore, it was only, quote, only to account for these spiritual depictions rather than to explain any properties of men that remained unaccounted for by the standard means of accidents, end of quote, that this group of thinkers engaged in with the notion of soul. The supposed Quranic depiction specifically of the ruh, however, becomes less vivid as one studies the relevant passages closely. Indeed, as Shihadi seems to imply in a footnote, early theologians appear to have reached this conclusion, or the conclusion that their idea of the human soul stems from the Quran based on two flawed premises. First, it was assumed that ruh and nafs were homonyms, ism mushtarak, even though, as Jane Smith and Yvonne Haddad observe, the Quran uses nafs and ruh in very different ways. Second, several senses in which the word ruh occurs in the Quran were discounted or de-emphasized. I now reach the next part, which is the word ruh in Arabic lexicons. I need to say something about Arabic lexicons before starting this. Arabic dictionaries and Quranic commentaries, as Toshihiko Izutsu observes, are valuable sources for the study of the Quran that can, nonetheless, quote, prove more misleading than enlightening unless we are very cautious in availing ourselves of the evidence they afford. So what I will try to do is to study them cautiously, you know, like I am going to use the information they provide, but you know, they need a specific approach. The earliest dictionaries were composed in the 2nd century of Islam, when the new ideas about the notion of the soul appear to have started gaining wide acceptance. It is therefore hardly surprising that the primary definition of the word ruh, including in Kitab al-Ain, which is attributed to Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad, is generally the soul with which the body lives. So Al-Khalil, like his primary definition of the word ruh, is al-nafs allati yahya biha al-badan. However, Al-Khalil, much like later lexicographers, fails to cite any similar usage of the word ruh from pre- or early Islamic poetry or sayings to corroborate this definition. This deficiency should not go unnoticed. Arabic lexicographers and grammarians depended heavily on pre- and early Islamic language to determine the correct meaning of Arabic words and structures. Indeed, the entire point of their scholarly endeavors was to record the Arabic language that was in use around the time and place of revelation, to make sure that future generations of Muslims continue to understand their scripture adequately. These linguists were aware that the fast social, linguistic, and intellectual changes taking place in the Muslim world at the time could affect people's understanding of the meaning of the Quran. It is also important to point out that in the scarce instances in which Arabic dictionaries cite early usages of the word ruh, the word is explained as blown air rather than soul. Besides, in lexical analyses of the ra, waw, ha root, the idea of soul or spirit emerges only with the word ruh, as opposed to other connotations that are reflected in various derivatives of this root. So here I will move to the discussion of the root rawaha, and I will base my discussion mostly on Lisan al-Arab, Ibn Manzur's Lisan al-Arab. The reason is because he gives a very elaborate and long, detailed discussion, and like he draws on earlier sources. So I believe he is as good as any other, but just because of the way he writes, I think he's good to use. So the root ra, waw, ha, or ra, ya, ha, denotes mainly the idea of moving air. For example, so here Ibn Manzur, these are the main ideas. It's moving air, smell, and then there is a connotation of pleasantness that is also connected to this. So for example, Ibn Manzur explains the word rih. He explains that the word rih means wind. Yawm rah means a windy day. The passive participles marih and maruh, when modifying a branch or a tree, means that the branch is stricken by wind and that the tree has shed its leaves because it was hit by wind. And the noun of place, marwaha, means wind corridor. So all of this, it's this moving air. Another air-related connotation of this root is smell, something that is carried to the olfactory bulbs through the air. Thus, arwah al-lahm means that spoiled meat, like it is said about spoiled meat when it emits a foul odor. And istarwah al-fahl means that a male animal has found the smell of its female. This root has also a connotation of pleasantness, happiness, comfort, vastness, and generosity. This positive connotation is linked to the good sensation resulting from the gentle movement of air, something that is particularly appreciated in the mostly hot weather of the Arabian Peninsula. Thus, the verb raha means to be cool and nice, barada wa taba. A yawm ra'ih or a layla ra'iha means a pleasant day or night, tayyib or tayyiba, presumably because of its breezy, cool weather. And Ibn Manzur gives this, explanation. Rayhan designates any plant that has a pleasant smell. The idea of pleasantness is particularly reflected in the word rawh, which is, by the way, a Qur'anic word, which besides the idea of cool breeze, means also joy and happiness, as-surur wal-farah. In metaphorical uses, derivatives of this root are borrowed to designate gentle yet slightly excited movement, the effect of which recalls that of a cool breeze. So we have, for example, the word ariyahiyya, which means this kind of open, pleasant, generous character, like someone who is moving forward, giving, etc. Like there are all these positive connotations linked to it. Thus, although the verb raha can be used with a human being, the metaphor raha al-amr is, like someone who moves with all his soul or spirit towards something, someone who does something excitedly, right? So thus, although the verb raha can be used with a human being, the metaphor is effective because of the shared feature of movement and the similar pleasant effect. The semantic field of this root then revolves mainly around the movement of air and frequently the pleasant feeling that ensues from such movement when it is brisk yet gentle. Moving to the word ruh. Ibn Manzur draws on kalam al-Arab, the speech of Arabs, and supposedly from the Quran, but in reality from Qur'anic exegesis, to illustrate its usages and meanings. So, from kalam al-Arab, Ibn Manzur cites a verse belonging to the early Islamic poet Dhur Rumma, who died in the year 117 of the Islamic calendar, in which this poet tells a companion of his to kindle the fire with his ruh, which, by Ibn Manzur's explanation means enliven the fire with your own blown breath. أحيها بنفخك. Ibn Manzur reports a similar usage from Abu Duqaysh al-A'rabi, a major informant on the Arabic language, who, according to his biographer As-Safadi, counted among his students the linguists Abu Ubaidah, Al-Asma'i, and Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad. Abu Duqaysh is reported to have said, one of us betook himself to a water skin and filled it from his ruh. عمد منا رجل إلى قربة فملأها من روحه. In both usages, therefore, the word ruh means blown air or blown breath, which, consistent with other derivatives of the root, is a type of moving air. From Qur'anic exegesis, Ibn Mandur gives us this list here. So, like he defines the word ruh in the Quran as primarily as soul, breath, the Archangel Gabriel, another angel, the Holy Spirit, another type of metaphysical beings, which are very fantastical with thousands of tongues and thousands of wings and, very, very paranormal beings, Jesus, revelation or the command of prophethood, al-wahi or amr al-nubuwa, the Quran, the command, happiness, and mercy. Although Ibn Mandur identifies a few underlying themes that would justify the grouping of these seemingly disparate items under the same word, his effort falls short of accounting for the entire list. For example, he uses a soul-related metaphor to rationalize the designation of the Quran as ruh, proposing that this scripture may be perceived as life that supersedes the death of disbelief. He draws also on the positive connotation associated with the ra, waw, ha root to account for the designation of Jesus as ruh. Jesus is thus called, he explains, on account of his quality as mercy to those who follow him. In spite of this harmonizing effect, some words remain unaccounted for. It is not clear, for example, in what capacity the ambiguous concept of amr or the different metaphysical beings fit in this list. One notes also that the movement of air, a salient connotation of the other derivatives of the ra, waw, ha root, is hardly discernible in Ibn Mandur's treatment of the Qur'anic word ruh. Even when he cites nafas, breath, nafas, as one of the possible meanings of the word ruh, he presents this concept in the sense of the long-term capacity of breathing, the cessation of which would cause a person to die, rather than as a single or repeated puffs of air. It's not like the idea of nafkh or nafkha, like one single thing. It's the capacity of breathing throughout our lives. Breath in the sense of nafas is therefore more reminiscent of the idea of soul than of blowing air into something. In other instances, even if the connotation of moving air can be inferred, it is still remote. Some people, of course, say, like angels are ruh because they are made of air. But it's, in my opinion, like this is a little bit like removed. Like there is a little bit of effort, special effort to reach this conclusion. So one often has to exert special speculative effort to reach these ideas. It should be noted, however, that this ambiguity arises not only from a possible misunderstanding of the Qur'anic word ruh, but also from the elusiveness of this notion in its Qur'anic context. For example, in some instances, the Qur'an seems to use this word to designate a person, whereas in others it uses it to refer to an abstract notion. This and other traits of the Qur'anic word ruh, on which I will elaborate later, contribute significantly to this ambiguity. Michael Sells holds a similar understanding of the Qur'anic word ruh. In his entry titled Spirit in the Encyclopedia of the Quran, he writes, quote, "In pre-Islamic poetry, the Arabic word ruh refers to a blowing or breathing, whereas in the Quran he maintains it appears 21 times, but in the sense of spirit rather than blowing." Sells' statement therefore indicates that in his view, the word ruh underwent a change in meaning. Ibn Mandur does not seem to hold the same opinion. However, a close reading of his treatment of this word leads to the same conclusion. The two sets of definitions that he provides for the word ruh, the one he derives from Kalam al-Arab and the one he derives from the Quran, seem to have little in common. By contrasting the Quranic meaning of the word ruh to the pre-Islamic one, Sells appears to imply that the Quran introduced this change. Ibn Mandur, again, does not seem to notice the dichotomy between the extra-Quranic and what he takes as the Quranic meaning of the word ruh, yet from his discussion, one may derive the same view. Based on Ibn Manzur's treatment of the word ruh, one can see that whereas among Bedouins and in early Islamic poetry this word continued to denote the idea of blown air, in the Quran it acquired a number of meanings, most notably the idea of soul. Situating this change in meaning with the Quran, however, is somewhat problematic. It is not implausible, of course, to suggest that the Quran would add new nuances to a word or to disregard some of its common connotations. This scripture introduces many new ideas and often discusses aspects of the metaphysical realm which the Arabic language perhaps has no way of denoting. It is not surprising, therefore, that it would coin new words or add new connotations for ones that are already in use. However, to disregard or completely de-emphasize the main or sole meaning of a word that is already in use and replace it with a new meaning seems inexplicable. Indeed, this seems like an unjustifiable linguistic statement, as if the scripture is telling Arabs what the meaning of a given word should be rather than using it in ways that would make sense to them and which would enable them to understand the larger message of which it is a part. The unlikelihood of this scenario warrants skepticism. Now I will move to ruh in the Quran. What I will do here is just, go through the verses where the word ruh occurs, and I'm not going to include the idea of soul. So here, in a way, I'm proposing my own reading, and I will see, without the idea of soul, what we can do with these verses. So although the assumption of the Quran that the Quran would change the meaning of a certain word seems implausible, it is still to be admitted that ruh in this scripture is indeed more complex and more ambiguous than extra-Quranic contexts. Whereas in the verse of the Rumma and Abu Qudduqaysh's sentence merely describe a human being in the process of blowing air into something, the Quran depicts the ruh in utterly different contexts and scenarios. Furthermore, the Quranic ruh is extremely powerful. Whereas in the two early extra-Quranic usages, the limit of what ruh does is to enliven fire or inflate a watery skin, ruh in the Quran can go so far as to transform inanimate matter into a living being. Besides, blown air, as we know it, barely has any manifestations. In contrast, ruh in the Quran can speak, carry things, and cross inconceivably long distances and spans of time. In this section, I will discuss the different usages of the Quranic ruh, categorizing them according to the verbs with which they are used. So again, the idea, I don't want to delimit the meaning of the Quranic word ruh. Actually, what I would like to do is to highlight the ambiguity of this verse. When we go through this list, it becomes quite ambiguous. The meaning becomes very ambiguous. I start with ruh as nafakha, with the verb nafakha, or ruh as a life-generating entity. So this is ruh with nafakha and with wahaba. 6 verses in the Quran. And here are the 6 verses, the 3 are here and the next are in the following slide. I will show it in a minute. 6 verses, 3 of which discussing the creation of the first human being. These are in Surah Al-Hijr, Surah Sad, 2 identical verses, and Surah Al-Sajdah. And 3 more discussing, or which are generally understood as a reference to Mary's virginal conception of Jesus. These are in Surah Maryam, Surah Al-Anbiya and Al-Tahrim, present the word ruh as a life-giving or life-infusing power or person. In these verses, ruh is consistently attributed to God. So we have ruhi, ruhana, ruhahu. And in 5 of them, this word occurs with the verb nafakha, to blow. Although the image we have here is reminiscent of someone who blows air in something, the fact that the agent is God makes such image too anthropomorphic from an Islamic standpoint, thus creating one of this word's numerous difficulties. More interestingly, when the word ruh is used in conjunction with the verb wahaba, to give, it is depicted as a person or as something that is transformed into a person, as it takes the shape of a human being who speaks to Mary. In this instance, God sends rather than blows his ruh. The latter gives Mary a son. Now, the second is ruh as a help-providing power. This is ruh with the verb ayyada in Arabic. In 4 verses, the word ruh is used in combination with the verb ayyada, to aid or to assist. In 3 of these, it is also used in conjunction with the word al-Qudus. So we have the phrase Ruh al-Qudus. Whereas in the 4th, it is simply described as a ruh from him, presumably from God. In all 4 verses, God assists a given party with ruh. When the phrase Ruh al-Qudus is used, the beneficiary of God's help is Jesus, whereas in the 4th instance, the beneficiaries are the believers. This is another intriguing usage of the word ruh. It is difficult to visualize how a simple breath or an air puff can assist a human being. Besides, the definite construction, Ruh al-Qudus, presents ruh as a specific being, perhaps even as a person. This depiction seems inconsistent with the idea of mere blown air. By contrast, the ruh that aids the believers is indefinite. It is a ruh from God. One is unsure here whether, like these words, like the Ruh al-Qudus and the Ruh min, whether they designate the same being or different beings. Now, ruh with the verbs, so this is also ruh with, that helps. Now, with the verbs, nazzala bi and nazzala and nazala bi. So, ruh brings down or sends down something, presumably from the heavens to earth. In 3 verses, the word ruh occurs in conjunction with the verbs denoting the idea of bringing or sending something down. In Surah An-Nahl, verse 2, Surah number 16, verse 2, God sends down the angels with the ruh from his command upon whomever he wants of his subjects. يُنَزِّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةَ بِالرُّوحِ مِنْ أَمْرِهِ عَلَى مَنْ يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. The particle be here can either mean with, meaning that the angels carry the ruh down, or by, implying that God sends angels down through the medium of the ruh. In verse 102 of the same surah, Ruh al-Qudus brings down what appears to be the Qur'an. Similarly, in Surah Al-Shu'ara, verse 193, Ar-Ruh al-Amin, the faithful or trustworthy ruh, brings down what is presumably also the Qur'an. These usages lead to more questions. Are Ruh al-Qudus, Ar-Ruh al-Amin, and the unmodified ruh identical or related? Is the ruh in surah number 16 and 2, like the one in Surah An-Nahl, is it something that has more or less agency than the angels? Is the ruh bringing the angels down, or are the angels bringing the ruh down? Like the verse lends itself to both readings. Now I reach the next category, which is ruh with the verbs to inspire and to cast. In one verse, which is Surah Al-Shura, the term ruh occurs with the verb awha, to inspire. This verb is used in the Quran with a wide selection of agents, recipients, and contents, but most typically, the agent is God. Like a lot of people actually do the wahi, awha, in the Quran. Even the shaitan does the awha. But most commonly, it is God who inspires. The recipient is Muhammad, the recipient of wahi is Muhammad or another prophet, whereas the content is typically a divine command, teaching, or revelation. The sentence, thus we inspired you a ruh of our command, or from our command, or from our affair. It's وَكَذَلِكَ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ رُوحًا مِنْ أَمْرِنَا is another elusive statement. The particle min here can either mean some of, or it can mean from. Whereas the word amr can mean order or command, or also it can mean matter or affair. The context is not helpful to guess the exact meaning of any of these words. So here we have 3 words, even like the most simple of them. Min can have like 2 interpretations. Amr is very elusive, ruh is elusive. So with a sentence like this, what are we going to do? And the other verse, يُلْقِي الرُّوحَ مِنْ أَمْرِهِ, which is used with the alqa, is also similar to this. Like we don't know what is exactly being alqa and what is amr, etc. Now, the next category is Jesus is ruh. In one of the rare instances where ruh is used in a nominal sentence, Jesus is identified as ruh from God. This is also an intriguing usage. Is Jesus called ruh because his conception was performed through a puff of blown air? Is it because of his miraculous abilities, specifically his ability to revive the dead? Is it because of the special assistance he obtains from Ruh al-Qudus? Again, more questions. Ruh with araja, to ascend, تنزل, to descend, and stand, or qama, to stand. The last three occurrences of the word ruh in the Quran, this is following the textual order, not the chronological order of the Quran, capture the ruh in different types of movement. In verse 4, Surah Al-Ma'arij, Surah number 70, we are told that the angels and the ruh ascend to God on a day that is 50,000 years long. In Surah Al-Naba, verse 38, both the ruh and the angels stand in line, silent unless or until God authorizes them to speak. In the last occurrence, the ruh and the angels are depicted as coming down from every command or every affair on the night of power, Laylat al-Qadr. Besides the different types of movement attributed to this ruh in these verses, this being is again depicted as if it is a person. It accompanies the angels, it has the ability to speak or remain silent, and it stands with the angels in complete obedience to God. Now, my last category is they ask you about the ruh. So the Quran says, they ask you about the ruh, say the ruh is of God's command. You have been given of knowledge only a little. In view of the unusual manifestations of the Quranic word ruh, it is perhaps hardly surprising that Muhammad's audience, or a group thereof, felt intrigued by its scriptural meaning. Now we have to imagine, I'm assuming that to Muhammad's audience at that time, the word meant blown air, they use it as blow your air. So here, for this audience, the capabilities, functions, and manifestations of the Quranic ruh are far beyond anything the members of Muhammad's society and humans at large are familiar with or can imagine. The answer, قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, has often been interpreted as a negative answer, as if the Quran tells its audience that they should not meddle with this question. This is a plausible interpretation, since one of the possible meanings of the word amr is affair. The meaning of this verse could thus be, say, the ruh is of God's affair, it's God's business, don't meddle with it. So the implication is, do not ask. Another meaning of the word ruh, or of the word amr, however, is command or order. If this is the implied meaning here, then this statement could be more informative than it is generally believed. If Muhammad's inquirers were perplexed by the fact that a mere breath can generate life, acquire human shape, and perform the various deeds ascribed to it, this answer may have been a type of reassurance. Ruh is capable of performing such extraordinary acts, they are told, because it is of God's, not anyone else's command. God is so omnipotent that he can cause a mere breath to perform such extraordinary acts. This interpretation, indeed, seems to correspond to the opinion of one of the early exegetes, I'm going to discuss this later on, who interprets the word ruh in the context of nafakha, nafakhtu fihi min ruhi, as omnipotence. It should be noted also that the fact that a seemingly inanimate being is ascribed unusual agency and attributes is not restricted to the word ruh in the Quran. Another seemingly inanimate being, Moses' staff, is turned into a snake that devours all the snake-looking ropes of the Pharaoh's magicians. The Quran's seemingly inanimate beings do not even need to be transformed into something different to acquire personhood. The earth and the heavens seem to be depicted as persons when they are ordered, come willingly or unwillingly, to which they reply, we come in submission. Thus, even if the attributes and capabilities of the Quranic ruh are by far superior to an air puff as humans experience it, its depiction is consistent with other Quranic beings that acquire supernatural capabilities or which possess attributes that humans are incapable of perceiving or experiencing. Another possible implicit meaning of the sentence, say the ruh is of God's command, could be that God should not be imagined in anthropomorphic terms. Whereas humans blow air by exhaling it from their lungs, God's ruh is blown by command. This answer is still too elusive to be informative about the nature of the Quranic ruh, but this is perhaps to be expected, since the context is too metaphysical for humans to be able to imagine it. By adding that of knowledge you have been given but a little, the Quran perhaps seeks to highlight that humans do not possess the necessary knowledge, tools, or experience that would enable them to imagine the Quranic ruh in clearer terms. Nonetheless, by using the word ruh, it is still justified to assume that the metaphysical ruh shares at least some traits with the worldly one. Now I move to my favorite part, which is the notion of ruh in Quranic exegesis. So here what I will do is like go from the 1st century of Islam till the 13th century, trying to see how this word was understood. Of course, it's only through a selected number of works. I don't know how representative they are, but from my general feeling, they are representative. They are fairly representative. But of course, I'm saying whatever I'm saying applies only to the works that I will be discussing here.
I'm standing just to get my circulation going. I'm enjoying this.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. So, to survey the diachronic progression in the treatment of the Quranic word ruh, I propose to study selected interpretations of the relevant Quranic verses from the 1st to the 13th century. It is to be noted, however, that students of Quranic exegesis, as students of Islamic studies in general, are faced with a major challenge consisting of the scarcity of material from the genre's early history. To solve this problem, I propose to consult the early authorities cited by Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. This exegete, as many modern and pre-modern scholars acknowledge, recorded early commentaries with utmost care. He generally reported the available spectrum of opinions on any given topic, regardless of whether or not he agreed with them. It is generally acknowledged as well that at-Tabari did not seek to harmonize conflicting opinions. These traits make him an appreciably reliable source for our purpose. Besides at-Tabari's early authorities, I will also discuss at-Tabari himself, the views of at-Tabari himself, then al-Qurtubi, and finally the modern Tunisian exegete at-Tahir ibn Ashur. So here we have the list of at-Tabari's early authorities. I'm providing their death dates just for us to know, when they lived. So at-Tabari's list, or early list of authorities who commented on the word ruh, consists of companions of the Prophet and exegetes whose death dates range between the years 21 of the Islamic calendar and 153. In most cases, of course, like many of these dates are approximate, but like the point is just to show around what time they lived. In most cases, these exegetes understood the word ruh as a reference to the archangel Gabriel. This is the case particularly with the phrases ruh al-Qudus, al-Ruh al-Amin, and al-Ruh al-Amin. Similarly, the anthropomorphized ruh that visited Mary to give her a son is primarily identified in early works of Quranic exegesis with this angel. Furthermore, two exegetes propose that the ruh that stands in the afterlife setting in ranks with the angels, this is in Surah An-Naba, is the same person. The ruh, which is the subject of inquiry in verse 85, Surah Al-Isra, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, is also understood as Gabriel. Indeed, to some rare exceptions, and the only actually exception is when Jesus is designated as ruh. That's the only time that we don't have the idea of Gabriel in being introduced. But other than this, every time that the Quranic word ruh is used, someone at least would understand it as a reference to Gabriel. So this is the primary understanding of the word ruh in early Quranic exegesis throughout the Quran. The only exception is when Jesus is designated as ruh. Besides, some of at-Tabari's early authorities interpreted Ruh al-Qudus that assisted Jesus as the Gospel, al-Injil. Ibn Abbas interpreted the same ruh, the ruh that helped Jesus, as the name with which Jesus revived the dead. Ruh was also defined as creatures that look like human beings, yet still different from them, metaphysical beings who were many times the size of angels, the Quran, revelation, and mercy. Al-Rabi' ibn Anas reportedly maintained that every word that our Lord utters is a ruh from him. كل كلم تكلم به ربنا فهو روح منه. A general survey, then, shows that the most common interpretation of the word ruh in early exegesis is Gabriel. The second most common interpretation is another angel or metaphysical being. Less commonly, the word was defined as Qur'an or as another verbal manifestation. The interpretation of ruh as blown air emerges in commentaries on Surah 4, Surah An-Nisa. Surah An-Nisa, verse 171. I believe that I didn't finish everything. It's,
Do you know how to get it back? Just move to the left, the cursor.
It's okay. I think I can manage without it. It's fine. Okay. Yeah. I think, you know, I was worried about those dates and quotations mostly. I thought people should see them. Where am I? So, the interpretation of ruh as blown air emerges in commentaries on Surah number 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 171, which describes Jesus as a ruh from God. At-Tabari does not name his authorities here, preferring to use the generic phrase of Ahl al-Ilm, the people of knowledge. However, he says that those who subscribe to the blown air interpretation found corroboration for their view in the Rumah's verse cited earlier, when he says, you know, أنفخ فيه من روحك. In other opinions, however, it is maintained that Jesus is called Ruh because he was created through the word kun, be. This interpretation is perhaps inferred from the assumption that the utterance of the divine word kun was accompanied by the emission of air, as would be the case with humans. It is proposed also that Jesus was called Ruh because he was mercy to those who accepted his message. Remember, like, the idea of Ruh has this pleasant connotation attached to it. There are barely any reported commentaries on the Ruh verses that discuss the creation of the first human being. These are the verses, the 3 verses where we have نفخت فيه من روحي or نفخ فيه من روحه. Almost nothing on these verses in early Qur'anic commentaries. The only early interpretation that At-Tabari cites in this respect is from Ad-Dhahhak, who explains the word Ruh here as omnipotence. So this is the only interpretation. No one sees this as the ensoulment of the human being. Since these verses are used by later exegetes to corroborate the view that the Quran subscribes to the body-soul dualism and uses the word ruh to designate the soul notion, it is remarkable that none of At-Tabari's early exegetes seem to have perceived this connotation, the soul connotation, and more generally, that they had so little to say about these verses. One is unsure how to account for this silence. Were early exegetes too mystified by the usage of the word ruh to say anything about it? Did they issue, or was the meaning too obvious to them to require any commentary? Did they issue commentaries that failed to be transmitted because they conflicted with other understandings of the word ruh? So here we can only speculate. We cannot have an answer, but I think it is important to take note of this silence. Now, the interpretation of ruh as soul, that also is found in early Quranic exegesis. We encounter it twice in At-Tabari's earlier reports. In one instance, this exegete cites the Prophet's companion Ubay ibn Ka'b, who died in the year 21, so this is one of the earliest, according to whose chain of narrators infers the soul notion from the famous Alastu verse, am I not? So this verse says, "And when your Lord took from the children of Adam, from their loins, their offspring, and made them testify, am I not your Lord? They said, we testify." Surah Al-A'raf, verse 172. Ubay reportedly commented on this verse saying that God took the seeds of Adam, turned them into souls, fashioned them, then took a testimony from them to the effect that he is their Lord. One such soul, Ubay elaborates, was Jesus. This is the one that God sent to Mary. It talked to her, then it entered, like that same soul that talked to Mary is Jesus. It talked to her, then it entered her body. This is how she became pregnant. So she became pregnant with the person that talked to her, or the whatever, you know. The second instance consists of an opinion attributed to the major exegetical authority Ibn Abbas in his commentary on Surah number 78, Surah An-Naba, verse 38, yes. So this verse says, the day when the ruh and the angels will stand forth in ranks. يوم يقوم الروح والملائكة لا يتكلمون صفا لا يتكلمون. So Ibn Abbas reportedly identified the day designated here as the time separating the two trumpet blasts, i.e. the blast which will signal the end of this world and the one that will signal the beginning of the judgment day. During this day, he says, or is reported to have said, quote, the souls of human beings, أرواح الناس, and he's using the plural, will stand side by side with the angels for some time before they are rejoined with their bodies. قبل أن ترد الأرواح إلى الأجساد. End of quote. This report indicates that Ibn Abbas subscribed to the body-soul dualism and interpreted the word ruh as soul. Several considerations, however, warrant skepticism toward these two reports. First, the mere fact that the understanding of the ruh as soul is encountered only twice in the plethora of opinions that are attributed to early exegetes, there is really like a huge body of interpretations around these verses. There is silence with نفخت فيه من روحي, but generally they had a lot of things to say. So for this interpretation to emerge only twice, this in itself for me is something that looks odd. Had the notion of soul been ingrained in Muslims' worldview at the time, one would expect it to emerge more often. Instead, however, we find that most commonly, ruh is understood as Gabriel or as another angelic or metaphysical being. Second, it is interesting that the soul interpretation was inferred from two verses that do not seem to particularly lend themselves to this interpretation, whereas the verses that discuss the blowing of ruh into the clay from which humanity originates did not yield this understanding. So we have like the ruh standing in ranks. The context does not seem to lend itself, in my opinion, at least particularly well to the interpretation of ruh as soul, but this is where it was perceived. Third, in the two verses where the word ruh was understood as soul, it was of course interpreted in so many other ways. So this is just like one accidental interpretation among many others. Fourth, in the report attributed to Ibn Abbas, the word ruh occurs in the plural, arwah, as it is understood to refer to the souls of all human beings. In the Quran, however, the word always occurs in the singular, never as arwah. Now, another point, another interesting point in my opinion, the discrepancy between some of the opinions attributed to Ibn Abbas is another intriguing point. Now, of course, Ibn Abbas is the giant of early Qur'anic exegesis. He's the cousin of the Prophet. Presumably, he benefited from a special prayer from the Prophet, so he is usually perceived as the number one authority, number one early authority on Qur'anic exegesis. So we have different opinions ascribed to him. This exegete is reported to have simultaneously interpreted the word ruh in verse 85, this is وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, as angel, and he's also said to, it is said that كَانَ يَكْتُمُهُ, he used to conceal it. He didn't want to issue any opinion. So we have two conflicting opinions attributed to Ibn Abbas in his commentary on verse 85, Surah 17. Similarly, in his discussion of the verse 38, when the angels are standing in ranks, he is reported to have abstained. Again, we have كَانَ يَكْتُمُهُ, and to have interpreted ruh here as angel, as soul. So three opinions are ascribed to Ibn Abbas: Malak, angel, soul, and كَانَ يَكْتُمُهُ twice. These discrepancies can be explained in many ways, of course. To my mind, however, the phrase كَانَ يَكْتُمُهُ, he used to conceal it, which sounds like a disincentive that aims at deterring some parties from interpreting the word, seems to denote a controversy. The phrase كَانَ يَكْتُمُهُ occurs with ruh as soul and ruh as angel interpretations. The previous survey of early exegetes' understanding of the Quranic word ruh indicates that in most cases, this word was understood as angel, be it Gabriel or another one. It seems, therefore, that one camp of this controversy subscribed to this interpretation based on the most common reading of the Quran at the time. The other camp, it seems plausible to infer, consisted of those who sought to introduce the ruh notion. A third one, however, seems to have been reluctant to pin the meaning down to any definition. This position can partly be due to the fact that the Quran, at least on the surface, appears to discourage the interpretation of the word ruh, but possibly also because the Quranic ruh is too elusive to be securely pinned down to any definition. So here, to give a general assessment of what has been going on so far. It is noticeable that although neither the blown air nor the soul definitions were common in early exegetical discussions, the scarcity of the blown air interpretation, in my opinion at least, seems to be mostly due to the fear of describing God in anthropomorphic terms and the unusual contexts in which the Quran uses this word. So it makes it difficult to imagine, how you can just blow air and do these things. The agency and power that the scripture ascribes to ruh hinders any attempt to imagine it in human terms. However, since the Quran uses the word, uses a word to which Arabs at the time assigned a given meaning, it seems plausible to propose that still, like if the early audience of the Quran could imagine ruh in any way, it's probably in terms of blown air. It's just that they couldn't account for the capabilities and nature of this blown air. Okay, so this is, this is the general, and in my opinion, I see that at that time, the ruh as soul was really too controversial and too minimal, and I grew very suspicious from this. Now, I will move to At-Tabari himself. At-Tabari does not consistently express his own opinion on the Quranic word ruh, but when he does, he generally also follows the general trend of identifying the ruh with Gabriel. However, so in general, Ruh al-Qudus for him is Gabriel, Ar-Ruh al-Amin is Gabriel, almost this is his most common interpretation of the Quranic word ruh. Now, remember that when we discussed the ruh standing in ranks in the afterlife setting, at that time, it was also interpreted as soul. So in that case, we have ruh as angel, ruh as soul, ruh as Quran, many interpretations. So how does At-Tabari comment on this? He says, all of these definitions are plausible. God alone knows which of them is the correct one. There is no prophetic report to bear out one opinion to the exclusion of others, nor is there any proof that would tip the balance in favor of any definition. However, no harm results from keeping this matter unresolved. Thus, although At-Tabari, mostly defined the Quranic ruh as angel, he is also willing. So what we see here, he doesn't go so far as to say this is soul. He says it is ambiguous. We cannot really decide. We'll leave it at that. It is, however, noticeable that when this exegete is not commenting on the Quranic word ruh, he uses this word in the sense of soul. The following examples will illustrate this point. When the Quran says, this is in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 28, how can you disbelieve in God, knowing that you were dead, then He brought you to life, then He will cause you to die, then He will bring you to life. So we have two deaths and two lives here. At-Tabari, as usual, cites interpretations of many early exegetes, then follows up with his own commentary. One school of thought, consisting of Ibn Abbas, Ibn Mas'ud, and others, understood the four stages mentioned here as, the first stage is when human beings used to be nothing, lam takunu shay'a, followed by the stage when humans are created or born into this world, followed by regular death, then resurrection. So these are the four stages. One notes here that none of At-Tabari's early exegetes uses the ruh when they seek to illustrate the different types of death and life here. What they use instead is the verbs amata, to cause to die, and ahya, to revive. And distinguish between the first and second deaths by explaining that the second one is the death upon which you go back to the graves. So this is how they describe it, This is the death that will take you to the grave. This is, Now, when At-Tabari comments, now At-Tabari is not, of course, here commenting on the word ruh. He's giving us his own understanding of death. When At-Tabari comments on these opinions using his own words, however, he explains the second death as the one upon which God seizes the souls, يقبض الأرواح. Or he says also the death which consists of the departure of the soul from the body. الإماتة التي هي خروج الروح من الجسد. So here we have a very, the image is really of the soul, leaving the body. He gives actually a number of other, examples. He uses it regularly to mean soul when he's not commenting on the Quran. So in view of this, I'm just skipping some of the examples, I think I'm going too long. In view of this, one would have expected At-Tabari to be ready to see this meaning in the Quran. However, this exegete does not define the Quranic word ruh as soul even once. He has the idea of soul in his mind, but he never interprets the Quranic word ruh in this way. This, in my opinion, shows that the Quranic usage of the word ruh did not lend itself to the soul interpretation at the time. Had At-Tabari, who understood the ruh in this way, seen any clear evidence, even once, he would not have failed to point it out. Now, Al-Qurtubi. So we are, a number of centuries after At-Tabari. Al-Qurtubi died in the year 671 of the Islamic calendar, 1273 of the Common Era. Similar to At-Tabari and earlier exegetes, Al-Qurtubi understands the Quranic word ruh mostly as a reference to Gabriel and other angels. However, he departs from his predecessors in his discussion of the three verses that mention the blowing of ruh into the first human being. Whereas in early exegesis, the ruh in this context is defined only as omnipotence. Remember, they said almost nothing. They just spoke once and said it's omnipotence. This is Ad-Dahhak. At-Tabari himself does not say anything. Now, Al-Qurtubi, what does he say? He says, Ar-Ruh is a subtle body, Jism Latif. And he says that it is identical with An-Nafs. He also explains that the attribution of Ruh to God here is similar, because the Quran says Ruhi, in reference to God. He says this attribution to God is similar to the attribution of any created being to its creator. So this is similar to the idea of when God says, my earth, my sky, or, Naqatullah, the she-camel of God. So it's something that God owns. It's not something that is an intrinsic part of God. So why, if this is not an intrinsic part of God, why does God still say this? Al-Qurtubi says the only point of the attribution of ruh to God is to show its honor and distinction, tashrifan wa takrima. Al-Qurtubi deems that this is an important point to make, or this is an important distinction to make, because the assumption that ruh was an intrinsic part of God was made by Christians, leading them astray, as they deduced from this that Jesus himself is an intrinsic part of God. Besides drawing a clear distinction between ruh and God, Al-Qurtubi establishes a clear connection between it and the human being. In his opinion, نفخت فيه من روحي means that God instilled the ruh in the human being. ركب فيه الروح. This reading, however, is inconsistent with the Quranic phrasing, because the Quran does not say, I blew, or he blew his ruh in the human being. The Quran says, blew from or of his ruh in the human being. نفخت فيه من. So we have the particle min, ruhi. It's not like the ruh itself becomes part of the human being. So, Al-Qurtubi's reading of this ignores the min part here. Now, Al-Qurtubi's discussion of verse 85, Surah Al-Isra, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. This is where it becomes interesting. Al-Qurtubi also, he differs from At-Tabari in this context. As pointed out earlier, none of these exegetes, Al-Qurtubi himself did not say anything about this verse, verse 85 of Surah Al-Isra. Now let's see what Al-Qurtubi has to say. And we have a number of opinions. The soul does not figure at all in the interpretations, the earlier interpretations of ruh in this verse. Just trying to go a little bit forward. So Al-Qurtubi reiterates all these opinions, then adds, most interpreters say that they, meaning Muhammad's inquirers, those who asked Muhammad about the meaning of ruh, asked him about the ruh with which the body lives. Those who reflected on this verse said that the point of the question was to find out about the nature of ruh, how it acts on the human body, how it mixes with it, and what its relationship to life is. These are things that are known only to God. Al-Qurtubi still asserts that the meaning of the word ruh is ambiguous. He says, "As-sahih huwa al-ibham," since he explains that the Quran itself does not offer an answer. However, this ambiguity is not about the general meaning of ruh. This has already been decided as soul. In his opinion, the ambiguity concerns only the exact nature of the soul. He says, "The creation of the ruh is a great matter and a momentous affair that is of God's command. God concealed its reality from humans so that they realize their limitations. If the human mind cannot encompass the reality of a neighboring creature, how would it encompass that of the reality of its creator?" So, like this is the i'jaz of this. Like ruh is so close to us, but still we cannot know what it is. Al-Qurtubi's discussion points to a new development in the history of the treatment of the Quranic word ruh. Now, although At-Tabari accepted fully the soul notion, he did not bring in the notion, no, this is something that I want to skip, malish. By the time of Al-Qurtubi, we see that an extra Quranic meaning of the word ruh became an important factor. Okay, the point here, I'm skipping things, so it's getting messed up. The point here is that we see that in Al-Qurtubi's treatment of this word, we have the idea of sharaf and takreem that is also introduced. Now, of course, this is not Al-Qurtubi's doing. It has been there for some time, but we see it these are the works that I'm dealing with, we see that the sharaf and takreem are visible now. Ruh is a sign of, honor. I now reach my last exegete, At-Tahir ibn Ashur, who was born in 1875, died in 1973. I'll go a little bit backward to Al-Qurtubi just for the comparison. The definition of ruh as soul is first encountered in Al-Qurtubi's tafsir in his commentary on Surah Al-Hijr. This is the 5th time the word ruh is encountered in the Quran, when it is said, "Nafakhtu fihi min ruhi." So before that, the Quran has the Ruh al-Qudus and Jesus as ruh. So these interpretations do not lend themselves to the understanding of ruh as soul. And then Al-Qurtubi waits until the 5th occurrence of the word ruh in the Quran to introduce the idea of soul in the sense of nafs, jism, latif. At-Tahir ibn Ashur, however, introduces the idea of soul upon the first encounter with this word, with Ruh al-Qudus, when the word is used in combination with Ruh al-Qudus. This may indicate that the mere mention of the word ruh now triggers the idea of soul, whereas at Al-Qurtubi's time, perhaps it still conveyed more than that. So he was able to read it at least a few times without making reference to the idea of soul. But for Ibn Ashur, the first time he sees it, he sees the idea of ruh. Ibn Ashur gives 3 definitions for the word ruh. First, he defines it as a subtle luminous substance, jawhar nurani latif, which is indiscernible through the human senses. Ruh designates the human soul, he specifies. Remarkably, this exegete cites the verse, like how does Al-Qurtubi illustrate his point or corroborate his view? He cites the verse, "They ask you about the ruh, says the ruh is of God's command," seemingly to corroborate this opinion. This verse, of course, can hardly be an adequate corroboration for any proposed meaning of the word ruh. If anything, it asserts the ambiguity and transcendence of this notion. To use it as an obvious illustration of the ruh as soul interpretation shows first how embedded this notion has become in the Islamic worldview. Muslims are now capable of seeing the soul meaning in the verse that has the least to say about the meaning in general of the word ruh. Second, in my opinion, also it shows how little the Quran lends itself to the interpretation of ruh as soul. Ibn Ashur's second definition, he says, it designates a power from God by means of which extraordinary acts can be performed. And interestingly, he cites, "So we blew into her," meaning Mary, "from our ruh," to illustrate this meaning. This definition appears to correspond to the one proposed by the early exegete Ad-Dahhak, who explains the word ruh as omnipotence. It is interesting that both Ad-Dahhak and Ibn Ashur, at least like from a first glance, that both of them perceived a link between the idea of power and omnipotence, like they saw this dimension of power and omnipotence linked to the word ruh. Al-Dhahhak gives this interpretation in his commentary on verse 32 of As-Sajda, which is, نفخت فيه من روحي. Ibn Ashur sees it in the nafkh of ruh into Mary. The third definition. In line with the centuries-old interpretation, Ibn Ashur says that ruh means also Gabriel. This exegete, however, makes no mention of the various metaphysical creatures whose descriptions fill the pages of earlier commentaries. Ruh, as noted earlier, was often defined as an angel. So I'll just give like a few examples. Ali ibn Abi Talib is reported to have said, for example, that this ruh is a being with 70,000 faces, each face with 70,000 tongues, each tongue with 70,000 languages, and all, like this angel is glorifying God with all these languages. And from each glorification, from each tasbihah, God creates another angel. I don't know if it creates another simple angel or a similar angel, but in this case, the world is full of this type of angels. It is also depicted as an angel with thousands of wings. Like we have this very fantastical depictions of the word ruh in earlier Qur'anic exegesis. These interpretations, fantastical interpretations if you want, continue to appear in medieval works, but some exegetes seem to have grown skeptical toward them. Thus, Al-Qurtubi reports from the Andalusian exegete Ibn Atiyah that he questioned the attribution of this hadith to Ali ibn Abi Talib, the angel with the 70,000 whatever, So he said, no, probably Ali ibn Abi Talib never said that. So we see here there is a touch of skepticism toward this kind of reports. Now, this skepticism culminated in the total disappearance of such interpretations from Ibn Ashur's tafsir. To my mind, this gradual progression indicates, now I'm going to link this to my own work, which is about anthropocentrism, animals, like I'm unable not to see these things. So to my mind, this gradual progression indicates that Islamic tradition, or at least parts thereof, grew more rational with time, thus increasingly skeptical or even intolerant of the fantastic. This type of rationalism implies that humans now have the ability to encompass the reality of more and more things, which to my mind appears like an aggrandizement of the human being, accompanied with the reduction of the rest of creation to understandable phenomena. Now we can understand everything. We can understand the ruh, Something is enigmatic about it, but we know what it is, pretty much. Although, now I'll go back to Ibn Ashur's interpretation of نفخت فيه من روحي. Although Ibn Ashur cites verse 21, Al-Anbiya, verse 91 actually, to illustrate the definition of ruh as power, his detailed discussion of the same verse conveys mostly the idea of soul. He says, ruh is the power which generates life. God says, once I fashioned him and blew in him some of my spirit. This means once I place a soul in Adam that would transform him into a living being. The particle min means some of. He says it is tab'idi, ba'd. So it's not the origin, it is some of. The blown thing is a soul because it is a part of God's spirit. Now we don't know whether this is an intrinsic part of God's spirit, like that God himself has a soul in the way we imagine that human beings have spirits or souls, or as a separate creation. So here, again, Ibn Ashur says the point of this the attribution of ruh to God is to show its distinction because it is a spirit that God has sent. This, the discussion here is a little bit convoluted. So it is a ruh that God sent, but it's at the same time it is a ruh that it appears to be part of God. So it's not clear like what his idea of this ruh exactly is. In Ibn Ashur's interpretation, the awe-inspiring ruh is simply the human soul. By interpreting the particle min as tab'idi, i.e. as a proposition conveying the idea of some of rather than the idea of from, Ibn Ashur is able to avoid the Al-Qurtubi's inconsistency. Al-Qurtubi, as pointed out earlier, maintains that although God attributes the ruh to himself, this being is in reality only a creature. So God ركب that ruh in the human being. So Ibn Ashur, God instilled some of that ruh, that's it. And he solved this problem. Ibn Ashur's interpretation of the particle min as sum of may be linguistically valid. However, the verse lends itself equally well to the translation of the preposition min as from. We can understand it perfectly well as he blew the ruh from, blew into, Adam or the clay from his ruh, which would indicate that ruh is simply the origin of blowing. In order to decide which interpretation is more plausible, one has to look elsewhere for additional indications. This search hardly yields any results to corroborate the interpretation of min as some. The Qur'anic notion of ruh is too elusive to corroborate any interpretation. Furthermore, other than like this supposedly blown spirit, we don't see any other manifestation of the ruh. We don't see the ruh in the Qur'an as exiting the body. We don't see it acting within the human body. There is no manifestation whatsoever. So, in my opinion, we need more indications if we start, like seeing this as a soul or as something which is within our bodies. I now reach my conclusion. In spite of the Qur'an's seeming discouragement, the notion of ruh received a plethora of interpretations. The number, variety, and nature of the definitions proposed in the first century of Islam, however, convey early exegetes' bafflement rather than certainty about this notion and enhance the aura of mystery surrounding it. This was so much the case that the medieval exegete, With time, however, the number of definitions dwindled, and so did the aura of mystery. So ruh became less and less mysterious. This was so much the case that the medieval exegete Al-Razi, in his typical style, in engaging in argumentative discussions, almost argued against the unknowability of ruh. In his commentary on "They Ask You About the Ruh," he says, "The question of ruh is known to the least sophisticated philosophers and theologians. It would be demeaning for the Prophet not to know the answer to such a straightforward question. Such a failure is demeaning to any human being, let alone the Prophet, who is the most knowledgeable of all people." So for him, it's really like, why ask this question? But of course, like the Quran asks the question, so he has to deal with it. Al-Razi, of course, concludes that the Prophet must have given a crystal clear answer to the question posed to him about ruh. The only 2 points that he did not answer were about the nature of the ruh and whether it is created or uncreated. His statement, however, shows that the ruh is largely conceivable. One thus notes that from a mysterious and transcendental being that belongs mostly in the heavenly realm, visiting the earth only on special occasions. The ruh in the Quran does visit the earth, Laylatul Qadr, a number of occasions, like to help the believers, etc. Ruh came to dwell on earth, right in us, actually. It has become a body, albeit a subtle one. Because the Quranic assertion that ruh is of God's command, because of the Quranic assertion that the ruh is of God's command, Quranic exegesis had to maintain, or this notion had to maintain, a touch of mystery, but barely enough to account for this Quranic statement. In the most part, ruh has become knowable. This development, in my opinion, denotes a growing faith in the capabilities of the human mind. This, in my opinion, is a sign that the tradition is moving more toward anthropocentrism. The treatment of the word ruh illustrates the anthropocentric direction in Islamic tradition in another important way. In early history, in its early history, when the word ruh, came to dwell in bodies, it was understood as something that belonged to human beings and other animals. So, for example, At-Tabari says that the word dab, animal, applies to anything that has a ruh, kul dhi ruh, right? And when he comments, for example, on Surah number 6, verse 38, about like the dawab as umamun amthalukum, he says this applies to, it's like he only excludes birds because they fly, they don't walk on earth, so he excludes them because of the word dab itself. So at that time, ruh was common to all living beings. By al-Qurtubi's time, this connotation of honor and distinction has become attached to it. This, of course, predates al-Qurtubi, and it seems to have been introduced by the Sufis. Indeed, al-Qushayri says, as you all know, like the locus, he says that the ruh is the locus of all praiseworthy attributes, whereas an-nafs is the locus of all the blameworthy attributes. So there is this specialization now. In the modern era, however, ruh has become something that belongs only to human beings. And this is the opinion of Ibn Ashur. He says, like you just apply nafs to animals, you cannot apply ruh to them. Ruh is only, it's like it has become too good, of course, to share it with human beings. So this, in my opinion, also shows another anthropocentric direction of the tradition. Thank you very much, and sorry for having talked for so long.